welcome.
Hey gang, thanks. Hey everyone. Uh-oh, that's not a good start. Hey everyone, welcome to The Shape of Punk to Come. I just want to start off by saying thank you so much to Amaze for having me here today. This is my first speaking appearance outside of South Africa, so I'm incredibly grateful to be here at such an incredible event and be able to share the juice from my mind grapes with you guys. So thank you. So who am I? My name is Ben Rausch. Hi. I come from Cape Town, South Africa. Some of you might be familiar with me through my work with a band called Team Laserbeam, which is a video game punk band that makes really short, really cute, really strange little games. We have made a game called Wrestling with Emotions, which is a speed dating game for wrestlers. Hey, we got a fan. Yes. Woo! We made another game that was a dating game for ice cream cones called Snow Cones. Yeah! Another game that some of you might have played is a game called Dress to Express Dancing Success, which is a kind of hybrid dancing game mashed up with a dating simulator. Surprise. All of our games are just super short, super weird, but very sincere and very heartfelt. I'm also one of the organizers of Super Friendship Arcade, which is an alternative games party that happens in Cape Town. That's kind of designed as a way to help build a more diverse and vibrant community, kind of change how people think of games and how people think of gamers and of people making games. So we're just trying to kind of get everyone involved in playing and making games with us, and we throw these wild parties to make that happen. So before I started working in games, I spent my entire 20s and the early part of my 30s being involved in the music industry, broadly. I started out doing live visuals for events and then moved on to DJing and throwing my own events and playing in bands and running a record label and running a music blog. And just doing a whole bunch of stuff that all sort of orbited around music but didn't specifically tap that much into me making that much music myself. I was really interested in all of this sort of auxiliary stuff around that. So the stuff that you can see in the background there is me playing guitar with a bunch of bands, but triggering and manipulating live animation and visuals through the guitar and a guitar effects pedal. That's the last time I was in Berlin was in 2011 to do that with my band Johnny Farner. But all through that period of playing in music, I was constantly kind of pushing this thing on my friends, being like, video games are the next punk rock. And I think people were generally just pretty confused, and I myself couldn't even really very well articulate it, but I was like, this is certainly the next forefront of disruptive, subversive media. And now, having worked in games for a while and seeing the developments that have been happening over the last few years, I think that that prediction is pretty well on its way to being true. So at this point, it's probably a good idea to sort of like say punk with a question mark. What do I mean by punk? Well, it's quite a broad term that by 2018 has lost a lot of its power and means a lot of different things to different people. So I'll kind of look at a couple things that for someone would mean punk, for someone else would mean that's totally not punk. Here's a manufactured boy band that we put together to promote a Vivienne Westwood store. They kind of had a big impact. And a lot of people are like, they're the most punk band, and other people are like, they're totally not punk at all. Then there's the Slits, who I think are punk as fuck, who kind of challenged gender norms, racial prejudices that people had, and even people's idea of what punk rock was by bringing in a lot of influence from dance music, which punks at that time were all like, disco sucks, disco's the worst. And then you had bands like the Slits coming along and just being like, fuck that. Or Minor Threat, a band from the early 80s from the States who, unlike previous punk bands, didn't work at all with any existing record labels or management systems. They created their own universes, basically, through these teenagers creating their own zines, running their own record labels, creating their own touring networks, and totally changed the face of punk in the process. Or Fugazi, kids from that same era who by the late 80s were frustrated with how antagonistic and macho and tough guy the hardcore scene had become. and then chose to kind of turn that on its head completely by making music that was deeply emotional and vulnerable, by calling out and challenging aggressive behavior in their community. For me, I think it's punk as hell, but not everyone would have agreed. Here's someone who doesn't agree with that.
I used to like that. I think it's something.
Can you guys hear that?
I used to like that. I think it's something.
What's going on? That music, is that me? Yeah? Okay, let's try this again.
I used to like that. I think it's something.
Where's that coming from? Okay, you could probably just kill the audio. I think something's malfunctioning. But I'll summarize for this guy. He's like, they used to be punk, you know, but like now they say to people like, no more dancing, no more shoving each other around. I thought they were a hardcore band. That's what hardcore is about to me. I certainly don't agree with that sentiment. I think a band that goes on stage and says to people, look after each other, take care of one another, be good to each other is way more punk than some band getting on stage and cutting themselves up and putting their audience in harm and trying to be real tough guys and show everyone how cool they are. So I guess what I'm getting at is that what I'm most passionate about or most excited about is punk spirit more than punk sound or punk fashion. More than it being something that's defined by how someone looks or how a band sounds, it's about how that band acts and how they choose to be a band. It's the entire being of their essence that totally transcends music, totally transcends fashion. And so, of course, that also means that it transcends time, kind of. I think the punk spirit is something that we've had alive in us as humans for a long time, and it's led to so much of our most significant and important art. People who've come along and completely challenged the status quo and kind of turned things on its head and changed culture forever from that point on. So how do we summon the spirit of punk? So let's just start off with some regular little human. They're just hanging out there, having a good time. And we're going to try get the spirit of punk into them. So in typical Captain Planet fashion, I have some cool characters popping up with some power rings. The first one is radical new technologies. At each really vibrant or exciting stage through punk history, there's always been some tie-in with technology, presenting people with new platforms, new ways of making a lot of noise and freaking people out. Next up, you have close-knit communities. The punk band is like the core essence of what punk rock is about to me. It's about human beings coming together and connecting, about creating something that's much bigger than the individuals would on their own. It's also about the community surrounding that band, then celebrating them. Even if most people think that they're garbage, there's a couple kids that are like, this band's the best and I'm going to make a zine and I'm going to put them in my zine. Or, you know, people just basically celebrating subversive art even if it runs counter to what's popular with most people. And those communities, I think, are incredibly important. And last, we have, I can't even see what I wrote there, but basically shitty societies, crappy mainstream spaces that put people down, that treat people like shit. And you can kind of see that with the like punk sparks that like flared up from cities like New York or London in the late 70s. Berlin has an amazing punk heritage. And it's often connected to the fact that the mainstream is kind of like falling apart, and that within that people creatively start doing incredibly vibrant, incredibly exciting stuff. So here's another cool, exciting thing about punk spirit. It's contagious. It infects people around. The people that are surrounded by it become infected by this idea, and they themselves then want to go and start new bands. There's famously like this session where like the Sex Pistols played to like 12 people, and somehow 20 bands came out of that session, including the Buzzcocks, New Order, Joy Division. It's really amazing how that people seeing other people doing weird stuff can just like ignite this fire in them and inspire them to do their own thing. But there's a problem. Over time, this kind of like relay of punk spirit gets watered down so that it becomes less dangerous, less subversive, less challenging. Because it's in the very nature of punk to keep challenging things and keep pushing things forward, which is why already by the 78 you had post-punk basically saying punk's over, this is like what's next. And throughout kind of like our history of popular music, you've seen things constantly being pushed forward like that. But at the same time, things become cliches. Things that were once really challenging and radical somehow become safe. They become predictable and just watered down. So this is kind of how we get from Nirvana to Nickelback. That's how we get from Rage Against the Machine to Crazy Town. And that's how we get from U2 to U2. For the record, I don't really think U2 were ever that great a band, but it's a good joke, right? So this talk is inspired or steals a name directly from a Swedish band called The Refused, who released an album in 1998 called The Shape of Punk to Come. That in itself was like a reference to the Ornette Coleman Shape of Jazz to Come, which in itself was a reference to H.G. Wells's The Shape of Things to Come. And with that album, The Refused were basically saying punk rock in its current form has run its course, that it needs to evolve and it needs to change. And that album was a sort of manifesto for the future of punk. And musically, I think it was very influential over time, but the band basically exploded right after releasing the album. And I kind of feel like what they're getting at is that punk rock needs to essentially transcend music. It needs to become something more, and that's why I feel like we're heading towards games. So here's a quick quote from one of the songs from that album, New Noise. It says, "How can we expect anyone to listen if we're..." Sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing through this microphone. "How can we expect anyone to listen if we're writing the same old..." How can we expect anyone to listen if we're using the same old voice? We need new noise, new art for real people. So that's what this talk's about. And when I originally delivered the talk in 2015, it seemed like something that seemed kind of, I don't know, like it was a far ways off. And if I look now at the amount of amazing stuff that's come out over the space of those 3 years, it's 100% happening. It's happening all around us, and an event like this is a huge testament to that. You can walk around in the exhibition and just see so many really beautifully bizarre games that are completely challenging people's ideas of what games even could be. So I think it's important to recognize as well, like the punk heritage of video games. The very action of making games has been a challenging one from day one. But I do think it's problematic that it's pretty much just been mostly straight white men making games through the whole history of mainstream video games. And I think while we can find good examples of moments of studios or individuals being super rebellious and creative in what they're doing, I think we've got an awfully long way to still go to really get to a point where games can fill the space that punk rock held in the 20th century. So in looking at this, I'd want to talk about a couple of things. Sorry, give it a second. So I've identified like a couple of things that I see as punk rock weapons. These are technologies that arose that allowed basically the birth of rock and roll and the birth of punk rock to come about. First one is the combo amplifier. By giving people with electric guitars a device that was able to power and broadcast their music way louder than anything before, suddenly you were able to give really small individuals the power to make incredibly massive, powerful work without needing to have a whole orchestra behind them like you would have had to in the past. I think it's a really big thing to suddenly say needing to have 200 people to make someone cry with a song to needing to have 3 people to make someone cry by listening to a song. It really says something. The next one is the tape cassette. With the advent of tape, kids were basically suddenly found themselves in a position where they could A, record their own music, and B, distribute it by basically just putting a tape cassette in an envelope and mailing that across the world. And prior to that, there was this really difficult thing that you needed to be the Beatles or you needed to be Pink Floyd or something to get, for people to hear what you're doing. You needed to be super well connected, sign a record contract, have guys in suits behind you, pushing, millions of dollars behind this investment that they have. With the advent of tape, that completely changed. People could do home recordings and distribution themselves. And then the last one is non-sonic media. Sorry guys, I'm like a big sweaty mess up here. I'm gonna just act like I'm playing a show or something. And so non-sonic media is for me probably the most exciting of these rock and roll weapons. It's basically all the stuff that revolves around being in a band that isn't actually making music. And in some cases it's as simple as like how a band chooses to dress, what kind of instruments, what the instruments look like aesthetically. It also ties into stuff like album art and music videos. For me, like so many of the most exciting bands of the 20th century, bands like Devo and stuff, David Bowie, were people that like harnessed this non-sonic media to create something that was truly majestic and so much more powerful in conjunction with the music. With all three of these things, the most important thing, in my opinion, is ethos. It's not really connected to the technology or how you use it. You could be punk as fuck just, playing a piano or some paint drums or something. The really important thing is it's like, what are you about? Why are you doing this? What rules are you playing by? Because you get to make your own rules. And to recognize that you don't need to follow in the rules of people who've come before you. So with games, what are our punk game weapons? Well, with Amplifier, I see that being free game engines. A couple of years ago, you would need to be, well, maybe more than a couple of years ago now, but not so long ago, you would need to be pretty well educated or well connected or, really pretty hooked up to even be making games. Now with stuff like Unity, that's changed completely. The fact that there's like such powerful technology and tools that are freely available to people, that it's starting to democratize things and bring that bar down, that hopefully more and more people can start making games and we can start hearing from new voices. For the tape cassette, I see that being open distribution platforms. In my mind, Itch is probably the one that jumps out the most, but basically anywhere that's allowing people to put their games out there without having to jump through hoops, without having to prove themselves to anyone, is incredibly important. It's the same as those kids being able to put a tape cassette in the post and send it to a friend across the world. And I think it's incredibly liberating that we have these spaces that allow us to put literally anything that you want out there. In terms of non-sonic media, we of course have non-game media. This is one that I feel is especially neglected by people making games these days. And obviously the game is the most important thing. It deserves an awful lot of effort, but it's quite rare to find studios or individuals that are trying to create something bigger around their games. There's heaps of excellent examples counter to this, and I mean you can see a bunch of them in the exhibition here or involved in people that are around. But in general, I feel like we could go a lot further to get people excited about the, as I would call them, bands, the studios or the collectives of people making these games and putting them out there. With Team Laserbeam, that's something that we really try to do pretty hard, is to try create this whole universe around the band that it's about the games, but it's also about us. And it's like if we resonate with people, if what we're doing resonates with people, that's like a really beautiful, special thing. And that I know, like personally from experience, the stuff that means the most to me is the stuff where I feel some sense of connection with the artists that extends beyond just being like, oh, that's a really nice song. So, kind of in closing, I want to talk about where I see the future of punk games going. What is the shape of punk to come? These games will be fast, short, and loud. In a current paradigm that so greatly places emphasis on the duration of games, creating games that are just short, that in itself is a massively subversive act. With Team Laserbeam, we've seen a lot of negative response to how short our games are. And I think that's kind of awesome, because it's amazing that you can so easily challenge people's conceptions or preconceptions of what a game should be about simply through choosing to do something that's quick, that doesn't waste their time. Tying in again with JW's Hypertalk, people's time is incredibly precious, and I think it's important to respect that. And I think it's troubling that there's an entire industry that's been built around placing value over how much time can you waste for your players. So yeah, punk games should be short, fast, and loud. Shamelessly broken. It's such a huge thing in a games to say, oh, this game's broken. It's almost like the worst thing you can say about a game. But I feel like we need to start embracing more of that brokenness. In a big way, that brokenness is the human aspect, and for me at least, that's what's interesting in punk music, and that's what it's interesting in punk games. Seeing the fingers of the creator there, even if it isn't completely perfect, because people are imperfect. It's weird that we spend so much time trying to create these products that are hyper polished and like nothing ever goes wrong when we're ourselves fucked up, shitty humans, all of us. Number 3, destroy genre. We've established a pretty varied and interesting network of genres for games, but I feel like we still fall back on them far too often. Even if it's a game that's quite inventive, it'll usually be described as it's a genre A game mixed with genre B game. We're still very much trapped inside the box of genre, and what I look forward to is seeing people burn that box to the ground and dance in its ashes. Number 4, radical new voices. This is, of everything, probably the most exciting one for me. As I mentioned in the past, there's a very limited group of people who are able to make games, and also making games broadly for that same limited group. As Rausch would call them, the default players, white, straight males. In punk music, so much of the most vibrant, significant, and important punk music is punk music that's been made by people of color, queer people, people who don't fall within that default punk or default player category. And I think in video games, it's incredibly exciting to think about all of the new voices that are going to be able to participate in the conversation of video games, for people to tell their own stories. We've already been seeing so much radical, incredible stuff coming from people that were previously not given a voice within this space. And I think all of us here are incredibly lucky to be able to witness and participate and support in this movement. Number 5, kind, compassionate, and empathetic. I'm going to do another one of my face things. So I feel like punk music in the 20th century, while often very independent and very free, was also controlled in a large way to fall in line with the status quo. And even if you travel back to kind of like the birth of rock and roll, this idea of this like James Dean cool guy, like aloof and kind of unfriendly and kind of a dick. That's okay, cool. That's bullshit, basically, that's been perpetuated time and time again. So you get to the point by the 70s of someone like Sid Vicious, who's a total garbage human, cutting himself up, spitting on people that have come to watch him play, just basically being trash. But in kids' minds, they're like, oh wow, Sid Vicious is so cool, I want to be just like Sid Vicious. And as someone who's spent 15 or more years involved in punk scenes, I've seen the negative impact of that play out time and time again. I've seen so many kids walking around in matching spiked up hair, spitting on each other, just being gross, shitty, awful humans, and doing it maybe not because they're awful humans, but because they think it makes them look cool. I think it's done an incredible amount of damage, and I think there's a long way to go to reverse that. And I feel like with punk games moving in a direction that's far kinder and warmer and more empathetic, we'll start to see that tide turning. We'll start to see people saying like, hey, being a cool guy isn't about like, wearing a leather jacket and being a dick to everyone. Being a cool person is about being an actual cool person, being kind and warm and compassionate. And I'm incredibly excited to see us move closer towards that. And then lastly, there's no fucking rules, dude. It's definitely not up to me, a 34-year-old white guy, to come up here and say what these rules should be. This is an art form that's going to explode, and it's going to be led by kids. It's going to be led by people that fall far outside of my perspective of what punk should be, and they're going to be writing their own rules. And that's super, super exciting to think about. So thank you all for being here. Thank you again to Amaze for having me. I'm so grateful. Thank you to the sound guys for making sure you could hear me and see what I'm showing off. If anyone would like to chat about this stuff or show me a game that you're working on or reach out in any way, you can reach me through ben@koyojets.co.za or on Twitter @benrausch. If you'd like to play some of my games, they're up on teamlaserbeam.itch.io. And yeah, thank you all again for being here. This has been lovely. Thanks. I think we have some time for questions, if anyone has. Hey.
Okay. Hey, it was a very nice talk. Thank you. As I understand punk rock, and I'm not into it at all, I mean the music and the whole movement, but I got some friends who are punks, and they say like punk, one of the main theme about punk is no future. Do you agree with that? Or?
Not at all, no. So there's like a very definite fork within punk rock between that sort of nihilistic view of things and a radically different way of looking at things. So the band that I play in is called Johnny Farner, and we're like an all-future band. Like, and I mean, maybe some people would say we're not punk. You know, like as I say, it's super divisive as to like where people fall. The sort of movement that we were a part of in like the mid-2000s in the UK got termed positive hardcore. So sort of like hardcore music, but that isn't about like everything's shit and no one should care about anyone else. And I think that's where a lot of that bad behavior of people shoving each other around and jumping on each other and treating each other like shit, I think that's where that comes from, because it's like if you're like, well, there's no meaning, there's no reason for any of this, I'm just going to destroy myself and I'm going to destroy everyone else. I don't think that's helpful or beneficial at all, and I personally don't want anything to do with that corner of punk rock. But that certainly is something that exists, and I certainly think that that's something that punk games should fight against. It should make people feel like stoked about being alive and give them hope and make them feel less alone versus making them feel like there's no point to anything.
Okay, great. I'm glad that you answered that way. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else?
So yeah, you made brilliant points.
Thanks.
But they are like controversial. How can you make a short game and like at the same time it would be compassionate, like emotional? How could you convey some important message to player via like really short game? I mean, maybe it's a misunderstanding, and you mean like how long your games usually are?
Yeah, so our games are usually between 3 and maybe 12, maybe 15 minutes if you really take your time. They're very short. And I don't know, I can't necessarily speak too much for our own work. You should play some stuff and see if you get something from it. But being able to watch other people playing our games online with Let's Plays and stuff, we've definitely found an audience that like gets what we're about. And I think you can have like even an incredibly short moment, just like a little, as an example, in our first Snow Cones game, there's a scene where you try to buy a milkshake, and you're stuck at the bar, and it's full of people, and you know you're standing at the bar for ages, waving at this barman, and he just like flat out ignores you. And like, I think we were all putting, as Team Laserbeam, putting a lot of ourselves into that. Like me, that's like my life experience. I'm just kind of standing, being ignored, and I'm like, hi, I just want a glass of water. I'm like 6.5 feet tall. Do you not see me here? And just feeling like completely overlooked. And so we put that scene into the game where the bartender just won't acknowledge you for ages. And so many people that played that have gone like, this is totally me. This is totally, you know, it resonated, and it's just a small moment, and it just makes you feel less alone and like less of a weirdo. So I feel like we've had pretty good success making small games. I definitely think obviously like a big narrative and something really grand is like, you know, like you can't, it's like comparing like a huge epic 3.5 hour long movie to a 15-minute long movie, but the 15-minute long movie can make you feel as much if it's done in the right way. It can hit you in the feels just as hard. Maybe not tell as grand a story, but in terms of like actual resonance with the viewer, I think there's still a lot of potential within those tight spaces.
Very well. So are all punk games supposed to be like just catching some single moment of your life without like any big plot, like involvement of characters and stuff? Yeah,
like so a lot of our stuff is very intentionally vague, where in like, let's say you're playing GTA or something, they'll be like, this is who your character is, he's just gotten out of prison and this has happened and these are who all these characters are. With our games, we'd kind of just be like, here's this person. No explanation really, like no background or grounding. The beautiful thing about that is it allows the player to put a lot more of themselves into a character if you don't spell all of that out. And coming from our side at least, we're very big on surrealism and absurdism as well. And to kind of like hit those notes, it is really in your favor as well not to necessarily give everything an explanation or just be like, they're 2 ice cream cones, have fun.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks. Cool, thank you so much everyone, really appreciate it. Come watch me DJ at 11, yeah? Let's dance.